Well, Maxim, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, you recently wrote a great article about Russia-Ukraine, including some forecasts on your Substack, maximumtruth.substack.com, if I'm getting it
Mhm.
correctly. And we're going to talk to you about that, talk about your forecasts and the constraints that you're looking at when it comes to this conflict. But real quick, could you give our listeners a quick background in terms of who you are and your work forecasting Russia-Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for more than a decade. So mostly I've worked with John Stossel, and I'm executive producer of his TV operation. I've worked at ABC and Fox. And one of my big side projects has been electionbettingodds.com, where we track the betting odds across multiple exchanges and we aggregate them into one easy to understand number. So if you go there right now, you can see that Zelensky has a 91% chance of staying in office through April 22nd. So the bettors are bullish on Ukrainians holding Kiev and him holding out. And then my latest thing is this Maximum Truth.substack.com operation, and basically it's data driven journalism. And my latest posts have been about Russia because I was in Russia for 3 weeks, I mean 3 months, including when the war started. And so that gave me a little bit of insight into the way ordinary Russians are thinking about this. And I wanted to share that with people.
And before we talk about the conflict that as it is right now, did you make any forecasts before the invasion about whether Putin would have invaded Ukraine or anything like
Uh,
that?
Nothing public. No, I internally, I did not predict that they would do this kind of full scale invasion. I privately, I was predicting in emails to my friends and whatnot, I was predicting they would do something small, just like they did in Georgia and Crimea, because they had a successful track record with that. They would do a small incursion, which was wrong. They clearly thought they could do much more than that.
Cool. So now, yeah, it'd be great to sort of talk about your article. You wrote about, I think sort of like the big part was the impact or I think lack of impact on sanctions in terms of Russian daily life, as well as your view on the military situation. So as our listeners are listening to this podcast, we are entering the fifth week of Russia's invasion. And so what is your sort of macro view of the situation and when you're thinking about potential outcomes that this current stage of fighting can lead to, what do you think are the plausible scenarios? And then after that, we can talk about the forecast for each of those scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, still there are a lot of things that could happen. When I'm talking about this, I'm talking for like a Western audience. And so I'm trying to share things that I think we might have blind spots to. Like, I think Westerners would be surprised at the extent to which Russians do support this war, or even the ones who don't, many of them who don't support it say, well, I still understand why we did this. Um, of course, there are also some Russians who strongly oppose it, and thousands of people have been arrested protesting. So we shouldn't forget that either. But when you look at polls, if anything, most Russians tend to support the war. And I was in Russia for 3 months, and just talking with ordinary people there gave me the sense that the polls are correct. Without that, I would be like, well, who can trust these polls, even if they're done independently? Because people might not feel free to talk. But when you're one on one with someone in a bar, I think you can get a pretty good sense. Many people there actually support the war, and they feel that Russians were being oppressed in Ukraine. They feel that the West was pushing Russia around. They feel all these things that Russia gives as its justification. So it's just important to know it doesn't justify the war, but we should be aware that Russian public sentiment is not similar to Western public sentiment.
Something else you mentioned in that newsletter was also, providing a new sort of perspective on the current sanctions regime in Russia, and trying to I think the media and a lot of, Twitter, people seem to be very bullish on sanctions and think that they're working and, having a very sort of detrimental impact on the Russian economy and the people there. And what you were saying is that if you're looking at some of these metrics like the ruble to the dollar, or looking at how much GDP might decline relative to what you might see in some other countries, or even inflation, that some of these issues aren't as drastic as people are making them out to be. Could you speak a little bit about sort of your take on how these sanctions have progressed from the beginning of the conflict 5 weeks ago to today?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'll say I left Russia 1 week into the conflict on March 1st. And at that time, daily life was just almost totally normal. Like maybe some Western credit cards were being declined sometimes, but everyone's out on the streets, everyone's going to work. It was normal. Now, after that, Western companies started to pull out. McDonald's closed, IKEA closed, lots of Western places closed. And obviously you notice that, but still this isn't, when I talk with the people I met there and get updates from them, it doesn't end your life to have McDonald's and IKEA closed or the Apple store closed. So people are like, yeah, bit of an inconvenience, but life goes on. People are still going to, board games meetups. They're still going go-karting. They're still living life. They're still going to work. They're still living life pretty normally. Now, that's not to say sanctions have had no effect. I read articles saying their tank production has stopped because they're missing a part that they used to import. That's a real effect. But daily life goes on, and we should be aware of that. And ordinary Russians are not in hardship or struggling. It's just life.
Something that we've also thought about sanctions is not only Russia's ability to evade the sanctions now, but even if hypothetically the U.S. manages to get China on its side to help to prevent Russia from skipping sanctions, which I think is unlikely to happen. But even if that were to happen, do you have a sense of would the Russian population blame the regime or would they blame the West? Because, we looked at polls when we were forecasting, and prior to the invasion, Russians primarily blamed the West on the conflict. I think it was like 60% the West, 14% blamed Ukraine, and 14% blamed Russia or something. So even if sanctions sink in, do you think it'll have the effect that people are expecting it to have in terms of creating friction between the population and the regime?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's hard to forecast. I think it depends partly on the nature of it. I mean, one thing, if you look at Russian media, they play up some of the more flashy sanctions that we have, whether it's like disinviting a Russian from a chess tournament or from the Paralympics, things like that. And those things, I think it's pretty obvious that most Russians are like just annoyed by it. It's like you're just sticking it to the Russian people, and they're not going to be thrilled by that. I'm sure they would blame the West. Most Russians would blame the West for stuff like that. On the other hand, if suddenly all their stores are empty of food or something, or some basic necessity, it gets a little less predictable, I would say. And obviously they would somewhat blame the West, but maybe their own government starts to look pretty incompetent too. So yeah, that's hard to say. One thing I will say, getting back to something Andrew said, like, yeah, we have estimates on what's going to happen to Russian GDP and inflation based on these sanctions. So it's JP Morgan did an internal report that a friend in finance sent me, and they project a 7% reduction in GDP this year in Russia, which is like bad. That doesn't happen in any kind of normal environment, but it's also not the end of the world. It's a 7% reduction. It's worse. It's a little bit worse than our Great Recession of 2008. But it's just not the end of the world. They also project 17% inflation. Again, like very bad, but still, you're not going to be starving in the street from 17% inflation.
And just on that note, something that we've talked about in our newsletter is there's also like in terms of Russia defaulting on its debt is very unlikely to happen because they have very little debt, and the only way that they would default is if they chose to default, which would be more signaling rather than a indication of the economic conditions. And there was also some other analysis that Russia has traditionally stuck to a very strict Western monetary policy. And given their exclusion that they're having right now, they might actually be able to run a more expansionary monetary policy and actually counteract some of the negative impacts of sanctions. And so, it is like, you've talked about this, we've talked about, I think a lot of people view this conflict as time. And the real question is, can sanctions do enough damage fast enough? And I think the evidence that that's the case is not that strong right now. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, based on all these numbers and just talking to people there, my sense is that it's not strong enough to force them to change course. Maybe it'll make them want to change course and to work out a deal. There's no doubt that it puts pressure on Russia towards a deal. It makes a deal more likely. That being said, it's not forcing them into a deal. So when we try to put probabilities on these things, we should keep that in mind.
And also, I think something that's important when talking about sanctions before we move on is this idea of short-term versus long-term impact. How are you thinking about sort of the short-term implications of these sanctions on Russia's economic viability and the popular happiness in the country versus long-term? If these sanctions were to hold, maybe that's when we see some of the chinks in the armor of that Russian economy.
Yeah. So the short-term stuff is kind of what I've been talking about. It's what we can observe right now and ask people in Russia about. And again, it doesn't seem that bad. Long-term, first of all, I look at the JP Morgan and other reports too, which are in line with that. And they also suggest it's going to be bad, but not world ending. And that seems right. And when you go into the very long run, like 2 years, 3 years, it probably gets even less bad because it just means that, okay, with this part that they need to make a tank for, they just build a factory for that and they become entirely self-reliant, which is less efficient, but they don't have to depend on other countries then. So that's what will happen in the very long run.
Mm-hmm.
I talked with some Russians who were like, that's going to be good. Like we should be independent and
building industry domestically and such.
Right.
Actually, it's kind of a clunky segue, but speaking about long-term impact of sanctions, do you think there's any risk of de-dollarization as an impact of the sanctions? And I think related to that is, how are you viewing China's role within this conflict? Because in some ways, right, like long-term sanctions on Russia could help de-dollarization, which would be in China's interest, and they obviously have a larger role as well in the conflict.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've read that Saudi Arabia is considering pricing oil in Chinese yuan, and that would obviously be a step towards de-dollarization, which could be a problem considering how much debt the U.S. holds, and they would start having to pay more interest to keep holding that debt. So, yeah, I think that could happen. That's another thing that it's just it's very hard to predict, but it seems like the sanctions are certainly pushing in that direction. We can say that with confidence.
And do you think, I guess, how do you see China's priorities in this conflict? Like, do you think that they have a real interest in, Russia's well-being? Do you think it's more of a security issue for them, and so they just want to maintain stability in the region? What do you think their goals are, and how's that going to translate into, what their actions might be?
Well, they definitely don't care about Russia's well-being. I think I feel pretty certain about that regarding China's leadership anyway. Now, they are looking geopolitically at things like, okay, so we want to take Taiwan in 20 years, or whatever time frame they're looking at, and they are looking at, if they were to join with the West, completely cut off Russia, force Russia back, they just lose in every way, which China probably might be able to do given how much trade Russia has with China. What then happens if China wants to buck the world order and say go into Taiwan 20 years from now? Then the whole world's against China. That's the precedent. So I think that's definitely something they're considering when they're not putting their full weight on Russia, or necessarily any weight, to end the war. And that's not a good motivation. We should be doing whatever we can to discourage them from invading other countries. But that's where I see China there. I mean, on Taiwan, they're increasingly, in the last couple of years, they've been aggressive. They've been pushing even like American groups, like they fund university Chinese language classes. They've been trying to force universities in the US to not talk about how Taiwan is a country. If companies like Marriott Hotel list Taiwan in their website like options list, they force Marriott to take it down. The companies always comply. So China's been getting increasingly aggressive with their pushing Taiwan as part of China thing. And so that's how we know it's definitely on their mind when they're dealing with any foreign policy.
Yeah, I think that's sort of how we've been viewing China's role throughout this. And I think one of the things that we've always touched on is, yeah, it's going to be very difficult to convince China to side on the liberal world order, which we claim that they are a threat to, to support us to take down a strategic ally. So I think actually from that, we'd like to talk about the forecast that you made in your article. As Global Gassing, we do forecasts too. And so how we've been viewing the Russo-Ukrainian war since Russia most recently invaded was trying to view like this current stage of fighting. And so we mapped out like what are the possible outcomes. And one is there's a peace deal, before Kyiv falls, or there isn't, and that the Russian government either collapses before then or it doesn't. Thinking that if Russia is able to capture Kyiv, that the risk to their collapse is probably more long-term. And when it came to a peace deal, either, there'd be a draw, the West/Ukraine would surrender given to Russian NATO demands and territory, or Russia would surrender, probably after facing substantial risk of facing internal collapse. And so that's how sort of we mapped out the situation, and you sort of did a similar job. But before we hop into those specifically, I'm wondering, like, what constraints, like, how did you view each actor, and what they would want out of the conflict, and how did you use that to think about, the relative likelihoods for each of these outcomes?
Yeah. So I think our forecasts are relatively in line with each other. I think the most likely thing is a deal does get worked out where Ukraine agrees to neutrality and maybe does not agree to major territorial concessions. Maybe there are some. I think that's most likely. The next most likely thing, and so I think that's like 60% chance. The next most likely thing at like 20% chance, I think, is no deal gets worked out. Russia they've already taken a huge amount of southern and eastern Ukraine, which people don't focus on, but they've taken huge swaths of that. They take a little bit more of that, they trench in, and they declare it independent. And we basically have two Ukraine. We have Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. And maybe there's no peace deal. It's just kind of like a stalemate, like there's been in the Donbass area for the last 7 years or so. So those are kind of the two most likely scenarios. Then there are a bunch of other possibilities, though. There's Russia could collapse internally. I think that's only like 5 to 10%, because the attitudes in Russia are very different from in the West, and so they're less likely to overthrow their leader than we think. There also, the Ukrainians could shock everyone and start, with these supplies from the West, just start pushing the Russians back everywhere. They already are in Kiev a little bit, and in one other area. So it's possible, there's 5% chance, I would say, that the Ukrainians just start winning and pushing Russia back to Russia. On the other hand, I also give it a 5% chance now that Russia somehow gets their military together, or Ukrainian supply lines just collapse and Russia just pushes through the whole thing. They take Kiev, they just start running through. So again, those are extremely unlikely, but I think they are possible. So that's kind of my layout of the probabilities. Yeah, I'm happy to bet people on them if they want.
What do you think the appetite is of the West for a situation like the second one you mentioned, splitting Ukraine into East Ukraine and West Ukraine? I mean, we haven't seen that sort of split recognized internationally since like 2011 with Sudan, and that was, voted on. Like, do you think that they would stomach that? Would that be acceptable if it meant
probably
peace and
not.
stability?
I think the support for that in the West is pretty much zero. But then it becomes a question of what are they going to do about if Russia is fully entrenched there. I mean, just like what happened in Donbass with the Donetsk and Luhansk area, there's been a stalemate there for 8 years, and the West doesn't like that. Ukraine doesn't like that, but that's the reality. So basically, we just see that again on a larger scale. And that probably wouldn't be great for anyone in general, like these regions, like the Donetsk People's Republic, it's very poor. They don't have any trade. They don't have any like international recognition. It kind of sucks to live there. So it's not a good solution, but that could happen if there's just no peace deal worked out.
Yeah, that's something that Andrew and I have tried to think about. Like, what happens if there's a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine, but not a larger agreement between Russia, the U.S., the EU, probably China, as things are sort of heading. And so while the immediate conflict has sort of been resolved, like there is sort of two levels to the Russia-Ukraine conflict that are forming, and so like the larger international one would in some ways persist if the most extreme sanctions weren't taken off of Russia.
Yeah.
In that case.
Right. Now, yeah, that makes sense. And hopefully these sanctions do push Russia to make a deal, and that we avoid this kind of unrecognized perpetual stalemate war. I think one thing that's important for that to happen is for people in the West. I worry that there's a little bit of overly, Russia is the devil and Zelensky is like a hero of the century. And Russia is in the wrong, obviously, for launching this invasion, but we can't demonize them to the extent that we could never reach a deal with them. So that's kind of the error that I'm hoping people will avoid here.
Agreed. And something also that I think is kind of interesting, I think you might have also touched on in your newsletter. I guess I'm just curious, why, like, would you categorize what we're seeing today as like a proxy war? I mean, when we're talking about these other levels of influence and the fact that, a deal ultimately will probably be decided not just by Russia and Ukraine, but by these other actors. Would you say this is, a proxy war and maybe the first we've seen in a long time in Europe?
Yeah. Certainly from the West's perspective, it seems like a proxy war where they're sending enormous amounts of weapons in there, but not actual troops. sort of like, I mean, for Russia, it's not, obviously it's just an actual war. Maybe almost the reverse of Vietnam, where you had US troops and Soviet support going in there. Yeah, definitely a
Moving more
proxy
akin to
war.
Syria.
Yeah, right. I mean, I guess it's not the first proxy war in the world in a long time. You have like Yemen, where Iran is playing one of the proxy elements, but in
Saudi
Europe,
Arabia.
yeah.
You know, our forecasts in many ways are similar in terms of thinking, even if our final outcome, I would say, is different. I would say, Andrew and I are definitely more pessimistic about a peace deal being reached in the short term, just given the constraints in terms of what each side would accept as a minimum peace deal. I would also say that we're a little bit not optimistic is not the right word to use, but more bullish on Russia's chances in a larger conflict. Just given what we've seen, and something we'll talk about, I think, in a later newsletter. But a lot of attention is put onto the failure of capturing Kyiv in 3 days or 3 weeks. But there's multiple ways you can view at that doesn't, I think, discredit the entire Russian military. But to focus on the peace deal, I'm wondering, like, what do you think is the minimum deal that Ukraine would be willing to accept, and that Russia would be willing to accept, that both sides would be comfortable, like, leaving the conflict behind?
Yeah, I mean, this really depends how put upon each side feels, but I think perhaps like the modal, most likely outcome of a peace deal, you could imagine Ukraine says we'll be neutral, no NATO, none of this. We'll only take Western weapons if we're attacked, and meanwhile Russia will give up all the new stuff it's taken, but they'll go back to their the places they already had. And Ukraine, maybe they won't formally recognize it to save face, but something like that, I could imagine happening. But you guys, you might be right. I don't know. Maybe people are just so entrenched that it's not gonna be worked out, and they'll just keep fighting. But that's kind of the most basic deal that I see as being possible.
One of the constraints that we had discussed when we were thinking about this minimum peace deal was the constraint of sort of Russian domestic opinion and how that would have an impact on Putin's decision making. Do you think that they would support a peace deal if it seemed like Russia did not come out on top in terms of what they got? So like if they didn't get like the Donbass region, for example, would that be something that the Russian populace would be very upset about? They seem to be maybe even more neutral to this whole thing. So are they just not really a factor when we're thinking about what Russia needs? Like, how do you see the role of the Russian populace?
My sense definitely is that the Russian people will go along if Putin says something's a win and there's some way to justify it. Like, okay, they're not going to join NATO, and we're at least the places they already controlled of the Donbass, that they're staying there and they're staying in Crimea, that he can call it a win, and most of the patriotic Russians will say, yeah, we won. That's my sense of the kind of mood there. Yeah.
Got it.
Well, before we finish up, Maxim, what are the three things in this conflict that sort of like you're watching for in terms of viewing the situation? And in particular, is there anything that, like, if you saw, you would fundamentally shift your your forecasts? Your 25 would become 70% instead. Like,
Sure. Yeah, well, first of all, by the way, I'm curious. You brought up that you think Russia has better chances than they're often given in a large-scale war. I'd be curious to hear more of your reasoning on that. And
yeah,
yeah.
I think sort of part of it goes down to the way in which the conflict was started. I think it's been portrayed as, Russia tried for a shock and awe um, tactic when they started, whereas how Andrew and I have viewed it is more that it was the last um, like ultimatum that Putin was given, right? All throughout, last year, and in terms of Ukraine doing Minsk, in terms of doing off NATO, like, look, we are going to invade, like, here's our invasion force, it's going to happen, are you going to surrender? Because the West has said that they're not going to intervene on your side. And then things didn't work out in that way. But we still seen casualties be roughly similar across the sides. Russia has more supply that they can pull out from. They have stronger advantages, and I wouldn't be surprised this conflict's going to take many months. And so I think a lot of the assumptions is that they failed on the short term, and therefore that means something about the long term. Whereas the reason why they failed in the short term could have been, they were expecting a different political decision to happen within Ukraine that didn't happen, and now they've had to prepare for an actual war.
Now,
Andrew, would you?
what? Okay, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I do have a question, but I'm going to bring it up afterwards. I don't want to get off topic.
Yeah, stuff that that's an interesting perspective and points. I wonder though, when I read stuff saying, they've already lost like 20% of their effective force, and like I know they have other soldiers in Russia, but maybe not trained soldiers. I saw they've already brought in their naval infantry from their North Sea fleet, which I don't know, I feel like if you're bringing in those guys, it's not a great sign for your like overall. It seems like you're dipping into the bottom of the barrel there, not in terms of strength, but in terms of who you normally bring into like this kind of combat.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say it's fair that we've been surprised, and a lot of people have been surprised at the effectiveness of the Ukrainian military, especially as it's, funded and getting intelligence from the U.S. and
The
NATO,
rest
which
of the
is,
world.
yeah, like, I don't know how valuable, like, having U.S. do your intel, and probably having the State Department do a lot of planning and war games with you to help out in terms of fighting capacity. But if you also think about like U.S. Going into Iraq in 2003, that took us a month for a country that's, 1/3 the size. We had a much greater military power differential, and it's a much more concentrated country as well. And that still took us a month. And so, Russia's still more powerful, but the difference is less. It's a much bigger country with a more dispersed population. Like Baghdad as a percentage of population is much bigger than Kyiv is, by contrast.
Yeah. Well,
Wars go on.
yeah. Well, to answer your question, by the way, about what I'm looking at. First of all, I'm looking at the Russian advances in the south and the east because they're still moving there. If we saw a situation where Ukraine started pushing them back there, the way that is sort of happening in Kiev right now, it seems to me like the Russians got to make a deal. On the other hand, if they keep advancing there and maybe at some point start trenching in places, it's looking like maybe they're saying we don't need a deal. We're just going to take Eastern Ukraine. So I'm looking at the on the ground stuff there. Every day I refresh, the latest maps about where their troop lines are, and they are still advancing there. And until that stops or reverses, the kind of bloody deadlock scenario is still, unfortunately, has a good chance.
I do have one question. I know we're about to wrap up, but you have this website, Election Betting Odds.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how do you see the upcoming midterms, and generally speaking, just U.S. domestic politics playing a role in this conflict? If, as Clay said, it's going to go longer, a few months, it's going to bleed into that sort of heavy campaigning time. Do you think that then pressure will be on the U.S. then to be more resolute about its stance. Either do something very definitive, or then to step back, or how do you think that'll play out? Sort of this Russia-Ukraine situation.
Question. It's difficult to say there because it kind of goes both ways. Like the administration might gain points in terms of popularity by taking a really hardline stance against the evil Russians, but they may also gain points by ending the oil sanctions and bringing gas prices down a little bit. Right. So, and we can see they're definitely aware of that, and you can see they're negotiating hard with even Iran and Venezuela because they're worried about where gas prices are going.
Because other people won't pick up our phone calls.
Yeah, that's true too. So that's hard to say. I mean, what we can say, looking at the betting odds, is that the Republicans have a pretty good shot. Although it doesn't seem to have changed much during the war. Basically, Republicans have an 84% chance of retaking the House. They've got a 75% chance of retaking the Senate, but both of those are basically unchanged during the war. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Maybe all the bettors are on the Russia-Ukraine markets and they just forgot about the election.
Yeah.
Well, Maxim, this has been great. Where can our listeners find you, and any teasers about the next Substack post? Any forecasts going to be there too?
Well, the main place to find me is maximumtruth.substack.com, and you can just enter your email there. You'll get all my posts. They're all free. The next thing, I'll just be doing an update on the situation on the ground. Even since the last post, Russia has advanced in the south and east, which might make a peace deal a little bit less likely. And I also have more data beyond JP Morgan. I have many estimates from major banks about where Russia's GDP is going. And there maybe the average is a little higher than JP Morgan at like 9% or something, but it's in the ballpark. And so we'll be adding some more data on that.
Awesome.
Exciting.
Looking forward to it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Talking with you guys. Yeah.
All right. Have a good one.
Right. Yeah, you too. Have a good day.